My name's Madison Clark. I'm 34, a freelance financial consultant based in Asheville. No husband, no kids, just spreadsheets and long hours. Last June at a backyard barbecue. For my parents' anniversary, my sister raised a glass and shouted across the yard. "Here's to Maddie, our boring little Excel queen. How does it feel being the most useless one here?" Everyone laughed. Even my parents. But I smiled, stood up, and said, "Should I read the clause about selling my 60% to your biggest competitor?" The music stopped. The laughter died. And my sister's face went pale. That was the first truth I let slip. Just one. Enough to start an avalanche. The moment I stepped through the side gate into the backyard, it felt like I had walked into a staged play. Plastic smiles, curated picnic tables, and laughter that sounded just a little too loud. My mother's azaleas were in full bloom along the fence just like they were every June, and the scent of barbecue smoke curled through the summer air. I paused near the hydrangeas, scanning the crowd. The Clark family barbecue was in full swing. Roughly 25 people scattered around the backyard. Some stood in little clusters nursing drinks and retelling the same tired family stories. Others lounged in fold-out chairs, fanning themselves with paper plates. Kids shrieked as they chased each other with water balloons, weaving between the adults like little chaos agents. I saw old coworkers of my dad's, a couple of second cousins I hadn't spoken to in years, and neighbors I barely remembered. But I wasn't here for them. I hadn't attended this thing in over 2 years. Not since I moved back from Atlanta and quietly bought out 60% of the family company while no one paid attention. I wasn't even invited this time. My mother had mentioned it in passing during a phone call about needing help with her taxes. That was the pattern with my family: mention, not invite. Remind, not ask. I took a deep breath and stepped fully into view. Nobody turned. No one waved. I walked past the buffet table lined with burgers, potato salad, and red Solo cups. I heard someone say my name, Maddie, but it was more out of curiosity than welcome. I nodded politely, found an empty seat at the far end of a long picnic table, and sat. Alone. I stirred the ice in my cup of sweet tea, letting my eyes drift to the center of the yard. There she was. Belle. My older sister. Effortless in a white sundress and wedge heels, walking barefoot on the lawn like she owned it. Her hair was blown out perfectly as always. Her voice carried above the chatter. She was in her element, hugging people too long, laughing at jokes she didn't let finish, introducing herself with that fake humble tone that said, "I've made it and I'm still grounded." To the world, Belle was magnetic. To me, she was sharp edges wrapped in silk. She was also the same sister who once told me I was too boring to be interesting and too predictable to be powerful. She used to call me Maddie the spreadsheet like it was a curse. When Dad had offered both of us positions at his company, Belle turned hers into marketing fluff. I turned mine into actual equity. Quietly, strategically. I wasn't flashy, I was effective. But to this family, effectiveness wasn't sexy. Belle topped her wine glass with a fork and stood in the middle of the yard like she was accepting an award. Everyone quieted, eyes turning toward her like they always did. I stiffened. "To Maddie," she called out, raising her glass. I froze. She wasn't actually going to toast me, was she? Our family's very own spreadsheet wizard. Because someone's gotta be boring. Laughter. Real laughter. And then she looked directly at me and added louder this time, like she wanted the neighbors to hear. "How does it feel being the most useless one here, Madison?" For a second no one said anything, just smiles, some pitying, some amused. And that was worse. Because they didn't just see me as lesser. They saw me as furniture. Background noise to Belle's show. I could feel the heat crawl up my neck. Not anger, not shame, just a cold clarity. I stood. My chair scraped against the concrete with a slow, deliberate screech. All heads turned. I looked directly at Belle, who still wore that smug little smile, teeth perfect and eyes glinting with amusement. "Should I read the clause about selling my 60% to your biggest competitor?" My voice didn't rise. I didn't yell. I just asked it like I was confirming tomorrow's weather forecast. The reaction was instant. The laughter evaporated. Belle's face drained of color so fast it was almost comical. Her mouth opened then closed. Her hand gripped her wineglass like it was an anchor. Aunt Caroline blinked at me and whispered to her husband, "Wait, you don't own it all." Someone dropped a fork. Dad shifted in his seat, clearing his throat. I didn't look at him. My mother froze at the grill, one hand still mid-flip with a spatula. The burger she was turning began to smoke. I didn't move. I didn't smile. I let the silence grow roots, and then I sat back down. Calm. Unbothered. I stirred my tea again. I could feel Brielle's eyes burning into the side of my face. She was calculating. Spinning. Trying to figure out how much of what I said was true. And how much she'd missed while she was busy curating a life worth posting. She didn't ask me another question. No one did. They just kept eating. Quietly. Avoiding eye contact. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel invisible. I felt seen. Not because I'd made a scene, but because I'd reminded them without raising my voice that sometimes the quiet ones don't just keep score. They own the scoreboard. I didn't always know how to use numbers as armor. At first, they were just something that made sense in a world that didn't. We used to live in a small ranch-style house just outside Dayton, Ohio. Tan siding, cracked sidewalk, a magnolia tree that bloomed early every spring and dropped petals like soft confetti on our porch steps. My father, Richard, worked as a regional manager for a logistics company, the kind of man who ironed his jeans and expected his daughters to act like quiet trophies when guests came over. My mother, Janet, used to be a librarian before she stayed home full-time. She had soft hands, kind eyes, and the kind of silence that grew heavier with every passing year. By the time I was in middle school, it became clear I was the practical one. I was the daughter who learned to write checks and measure plumbing leaks. At 14, I got a job bussing tables at a diner on Main Street. Every Saturday and Sunday morning, while Brielle slept in or begged Dad for mall money, I tied my apron and wiped ketchup from vinyl booths. I didn't mind. Not really. I liked the rhythm of it. The predictability. You show up, you work, you get paid. Life didn't often follow that rule, but that job did. I remember one winter when the water heater broke. The house smelled like rust and wet drywall. Dad was furious. Said the repair would cost $500 and we'd have to wait a few weeks. Brielle was complaining about having to rinse conditioner out with cold water. I went upstairs, pulled the crumpled bills from the shoe box I kept in my closet, and placed it on the kitchen counter without a word. The next morning, a plumber showed up. By afternoon, we had hot water again. No one said thank you. They didn't even ask where the money came from. It was like they expected it. Like solving problems quietly had become my role. And once you play a part long enough, people stop seeing you as anything else. Brielle never worried about money. Or responsibility. She was too busy being homecoming royalty captain of the cheer squad, dating the quarterback, tanning in March. If I was the calculator in the family, she was the confetti cannon, loud, flashy, attention-grabbing. And Dad adored her for it. He called her his sunshine girl. Said she lit up a room. Said people remembered her. He called me dependable, said I was steady. Like a spreadsheet. He thought it was a compliment. In 2010, right before my senior year, we moved to Asheville. Dad got a promotion. Brielle got mad she had to leave her boyfriend. Mom got quieter. I adapted like I always did. New school. New locker. Same story. That fall, Mom had a mini stroke. It was late October. The leaves were turning copper and gold, and the mornings started smelling like chimney smoke. One evening, I came home from a tutoring session to find her slumped on the couch, her face slightly drooped, her words thick like she was underwater. We got her to the hospital fast, and the doctor said it could have been worse. She would recover, but she'd need rest therapy monitoring. Dad was distant, not cruel, just emotionally absent in the way only men like him could be. He buried himself in work, left post-it notes about medication schedules and doctor appointments. Brielle was away at college by then, already pledging a sorority and FaceTiming us with perfect lighting and a frozen yogurt cup in hand. It was never spoken aloud, but we all knew. I would stay. I had a full ride offer to Colorado State. A strong program. Far enough to breathe, close enough to visit, but I declined it. No one told me I had to. That was the thing. They didn't need to say it out loud. They just waited long enough in silence for me to make the right choice. I remember sitting at the kitchen table a few days after Mom came home from the hospital. Her left hand still trembled when she reached for the teacup. She couldn't drive yet, couldn't cook without supervision. I looked at her, then at Dad, who was already reading emails at the other end of the table. I waited to see if either of them would ask me what I was thinking. They didn't. I deferred enrollment. Took a job at a local community bank, started taking night classes at a satellite campus. I learned how to build a budget, analyze risk, file taxes. I learned what it meant to build a life while pressing pause on your own. Brielle sent postcards from spring break in Miami. Pictures of her new boyfriend, her latest audition for a campus play. I kept them in a drawer I never opened. It wasn't resentment. Not yet. It was a quiet sort of grief. The kind that comes from realizing your sacrifices don't earn you loyalty, they just set expectations. Every time I said yes, they learned it was okay to ask for more. Every time I stayed silent, they heard permission. I became fluent in compromise. In logistics. In keeping things together. I once overheard my aunt telling someone at a family dinner that Brielle had the spark, but I had the spine. At the time, I thought that was praise. Now I know it was permission. And the thing about always being the one who can handle it. Eventually, they forget you bleed too. By the time Brielle moved back to Asheville and joined Dad's company in marketing, I was already quietly carving out my path. I didn't want the spotlight. I just wanted ownership. Leverage, protection, and maybe deep down a way out. But those things don't come overnight. You have to build them brick by brick, clause by clause, until one day you realize the empire you thought belonged to everyone actually sits on the ground you laid. And none of them noticed. They never do. Not until you stop asking for a seat. Not until they realize you own the house. That afternoon at the barbecue was the first time they looked at me like they didn't know who I was. But I did. I was the daughter who knew how to do math. And I was done calculating for everyone but me. College by day, retail by night, and not a dime to waste. I balanced textbooks on the breakroom table at Marshall's and took notes on the bus home. My sneakers had holes by winter and I duct taped them shut instead of buying a new pair. Every week I put $50 into savings. It wasn't much, but it felt like control. Brielle's updates came in like clockwork. Her dorm room at the Miami Art Institute looked like a Pinterest board. String lights, designer pillows, a mini fridge packed with LaCroix. She'd post stories of beach bonfires and boutique hauls, tagging accounts with thousands of followers. It wasn't just envy I felt. It was dissonance. Like we were raised in two different households under the same roof. By sophomore spring, I had a 3.9 GPA and a resume packed with work study and community outreach. My advisor told me I could transfer to UNC's finance program with partial scholarship. I didn't even consider it. Asheville was home now. I still stopped by every Sunday to bring Mom her favorite lemon muffins and check on her blood pressure. She never asked, but she never stopped me either. Then Brielle hit her wall. Dad called me one afternoon while I was stocking clearance shoes. "Maddie, it's your sister," he said, voice low like he was delivering a eulogy. "Her student loans are a mess. She missed some payments and they froze her enrollment. She needs help." I stood there gripping a box of discounted Nikes, blinking into the backroom light. Dad cleared his throat. "I know you've been saving, just for a bit, until she can reapply. Family is about sticking together in hard times." I didn't answer right away. That week my coworker Sam got laid off. Rent was going up. My manager offered me extra shifts. I had my eye on a used laptop, one that didn't take 12 minutes to boot up. But I transferred the money anyway. $2,000. My entire savings. I told myself it was a loan. I didn't even get a thank you text. Mom said, almost like a sigh, "You're too good sometimes, Maddie. Just don't wear yourself out." But she said it while setting a fresh batch of cookies on the counter for Brielle, who had flown home for the weekend. That Saturday night, Brielle posted a photo from a senior prom party. She wasn't a senior. She wasn't even enrolled. But there she was in a blush pink gown that probably cost more than my rent. The caption read, "She believed she could." So she booked the VIP table. I stared at it for a long time, sitting on the edge of my twin mattress eating dry cereal from a mug. The robe I was wearing had a coffee stain. I hadn't done laundry in 5 days. My manager had yelled at me that afternoon for not smiling enough at checkout. I put my phone down and lay flat staring at the ceiling. I didn't cry, I calculated, again. That night I made a decision. From that point on, I would never give money without a written agreement. I'd open a separate account. I'd study contracts. I'd read fine print. I was done handing out lifelines with no terms. I wasn't bitter. I was strategic. At school, I started joining finance clubs. I spent weekends volunteering with local tax prep services, helping low-income families file returns. I got a part-time internship with a startup investment firm, one of those scrappy new ones above a vape shop with 3 employees and way too much coffee. But they took me seriously. They let me sit in on meetings, watch how deals were negotiated, how equity worked. Meanwhile, Belle continued orbiting a planet made of glitter and denial. She re-enrolled eventually with a different major. Something about branding. She never mentioned the money. She said we were even because she let me borrow her shoes in high school. One night during a rare dinner at home, Dad passed Belle the butter and said he was proud of her for sticking it out. Proud of what I asked before I could stop myself. Dad looked at me like I'd cursed at the table. Proud of both of you, of course, he said. Too late, too forced. Mom tried to change the subject. The casserole's a little dry tonight, don't you think? Belle didn't say anything. Just smiled with her lip-glossed mouth and topped off her wine. After dinner, I helped clean up while she scrolled Instagram on the couch. I found one of her napkins in the bathroom trash covered in pink lipstick and the initials TG scribbled in Sharpie. That was new. Probably her next obsession. I didn't ask. I stopped asking. My next step was graduation. I'd have my associates soon, and I was already being courted by 2 firms in Charlotte. They wanted women in finance, especially ones who knew how to climb without safety nets. Dad asked if I was planning to come home often once I moved. I told him honestly I wasn't sure. That didn't go over well. He muttered something about ungrateful kids forgetting their roots. But I hadn't forgotten. I remembered everything. Every ignored birthday, every time Belle's tantrums earned her ice cream while I was told to be quiet. Every time they said I was the strong one like it meant I didn't need care. So I stopped waiting for them to notice. I showed up. I worked hard. I carved a path. But I stopped hoping for applause. I became the girl who could calculate down to the penny. Who could see patterns in people's spending and their lies. Who knew that sometimes debts weren't measured in dollars but in silence, and silence I'd learned was expensive. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon in early May. I had just finished reviewing a quarterly portfolio report when my phone lit up with Belle's name. I let it ring twice before answering. Not because I was busy, but because I had learned to pause when she reached out. It usually meant something was falling apart. "Maddie, I need help." There was no preamble, no, "How are you?" Her voice was tight like someone who'd been crying but didn't want to sound weak. I stepped into the break room and shut the door. "What happened?" She took a shaky breath. "The store's in trouble. Like real trouble. Orders are getting canceled. My supplier just backed out. PayPal froze the account. I don't know what I'm doing." I'd seen the Instagram fanfare when she launched it. Belle fashion for the unstoppable mom. Glossy photos of her posing with Ezra on her hip and a pink MacBook on her lap. Articles gushed over her as a mompreneur, a term that made my teeth itch. People cheered her on like she was building an empire. Now 6 months and the cracks were showing. I didn't say "I told you so," I just asked, "When can you meet?" We met at a coffee shop in downtown Asheville. She wore oversized sunglasses and a silk headscarf like someone in hiding. Her nails were perfectly manicured, but her hands kept shaking. She brought a file folder that looked untouched and a baby monitor that buzzed every few minutes. She laid it all out in between sips of iced oat milk latte. Inventory lost in shipping. Chargebacks piling up. Vendors refusing to resupply without upfront payment. A business account frozen due to suspicious transactions she couldn't explain. I looked through her paperwork. It was worse than I expected. You never incorporated, I said. You're personally liable for these debts. That's dangerous. She blinked like she didn't understand the words. They told me I could do it all online. I watched a YouTube tutorial. I bit the inside of my cheek. Then I said quietly, "We need to restructure this now. Or you're going to drown." She nodded. "I'll do whatever you say. Just don't tell Mom and Dad. Please. They can't know I failed." I closed the folder. "We can fix it, but I'm going to need control of the business side. I'll clean this up, pay off the suppliers, renegotiate the terms, but if I'm investing money, it has to be formal." "How much?" $50,000, I said. Her eyes widened. She exhaled like she'd been punched. "And you'll get it back." I gave her a look. "That's not how investments work." She lowered her gaze. "Okay." I had a contract drawn up the next day. 60% equity transferred to me effective immediately. A clause that gave me full voting rights on financial decisions. Another clause allowing me to sell my shares at any time without her approval. I simplified the language as much as possible. She skimmed the first page, signed without asking questions. I filed the documents the same afternoon. Registered the LLC under both our names but with me as managing partner. I didn't rub it in. I didn't gloat. I wired the funds directly to the creditors and spent the next week on the phone with suppliers persuading them not to blacklist the brand. I rewrote the refund policy, brought in a freelance CPA to organize the books, and set up an automated payment system. I even hired a customer service rep from upstate New York who could handle the email backlog. And I said nothing. Not to Mom, not to Dad, not to the few friends I had left from college. I let Belle post her gratitude-filled captions about second chances and growth and resilience. She tagged me in one story, then deleted it an hour later. I didn't ask why. Some nights I'd lie in bed and think about how many lines I'd crossed in the name of family. How much of my own life I had pressed pause on. I told myself it was temporary, just until she got back on her feet. But weeks turned into months. Her business stabilized, sales picked up. She launched a new summer collection and started booking local influencers to model her clothes. At the 4th of July, BBQ Mom proudly told the neighbors that Belle was running her own fashion brand while raising a baby. I sipped my iced tea and nodded politely. I didn't mention the contracts. I didn't mention the fact that the brand had been saved by my money, my time, my knowledge. It was easier, I told myself, to let her have the spotlight. She needed it more than I did. But sometimes I'd catch her talking to vendors on speakerphone, misrepresenting numbers, promising things I knew weren't true. And I'd feel that familiar twinge. Like something inside me knew this wouldn't last. That one day she'd crash again and I'd be expected to catch her. Late one night, after finalizing a quarterly report for our investors, I sat on the porch with my laptop and pulled up the Belle LLC agreement. I reread the clause I'd written in bold just below the signature lines. Majority shareholder retains the right to sell or transfer equity at any time with or without notice. I closed the file and saved a backup to a flash drive. It wasn't just a contract, it was an exit, not for her, for me. And for once I didn't feel guilty about that. The first payment was $2,500. It came out of my emergency fund, the one I'd built slowly from tax refunds and bonus checks during my second year as a junior analyst. Belle had called in tears, claiming the warehouse was threatening to hold her inventory unless she paid the outstanding invoice. I didn't even ask to see the paperwork. I just wired the money and told her it should clear by Friday. She didn't say thank you. Just sighed and said she'd let me know if they shipped it. They did. And so it began. What started as a one-time help turned into a monthly ritual. I never offered. She never asked. It was just understood. Like rent or electricity or the cost of keeping a secret alive. By the end of that first year, I had sent her over $30,000. Some months, I barely made it to rent. I stopped ordering takeout, canceled Spotify Premium, sold my barely used Peloton on Craigslist. I took on freelance gigs with struggling startups, editing pitch decks at 2 in the morning or fixing someone's profit and loss statement in exchange for $200 and a late Venmo transfer. I wore the same black flats until they peeled at the toe. I avoided group dinners with coworkers by saying I had deadlines. I sent my landlord rent checks that left my account with less than $50 to spare. And I kept smiling. No one knew. Not my colleagues, not the girl I dated briefly who asked why I never wanted to split a weekend Airbnb. Not my parents. Certainly not Brielle. Every time she called it was the same tone, half frantic, half bored. Maddie the supplier in Charlotte is being a nightmare. They're holding up the lace shipment again. Can you believe that I'd be standing in line at the pharmacy watching my card get declined and I'd say transfer will hit by Friday? Or, give me 2 days. I'll handle it. I didn't ask why she hadn't built an emergency fund. Or why she was launching new collections without paying off the last batch. I didn't even ask if she was okay. Because deep down I knew the question wouldn't be returned. No one ever asked if I was okay. By 2019, I had moved 3 times to avoid rent increases. I shared a 2-bedroom in Durham with a woman who taught yoga by day and hosted healing circles by night. She burned sage in the kitchen and told me I looked like I carried ancestral grief. I laughed, then cried in the shower. I kept meticulous spreadsheets. Every transfer had a timestamp, a category, a note. By early 2020, the running total had crossed $100,000. Brielle's texts had gotten shorter. Hey, lace problem again. Can you check? She didn't call anymore. Sometimes she sent photos of Ezra in new shoes. Once she posted a reel of herself in a backless pink dress with the caption, "Mama's still got it." I watched it twice and turned off my phone. When the pandemic hit, my freelance work dried up for 2 months. I panicked, cut back everything, and still sent the April payment. I remember sitting at my kitchen counter with a half-eaten bowl of cereal trying to decide if I should skip a health insurance payment to make room for another supplier invoice. I chose the invoice. Later that month, Brielle messaged, "Everything's delayed. Suppliers are crazy. This is so unfair." She didn't ask if I'd lost any clients. She didn't ask if I was safe. In August of 2021, I got a consulting contract with a biotech firm in Raleigh. It paid well, but the hours were brutal. I signed because I needed to rebuild what I'd drained. But even then, I didn't stop the monthly transfers. I told myself it would be temporary, that she'd stabilize, that the business would finally hold its own. By early 2023, the total had passed $240,000. I had no vacations to show for it. No new car, no updated wardrobe. Just the same cracked phone case, the same worn coat, the same quiet ache in my chest when family dinners rolled around, and Mom said, "Isn't it amazing what Brielle's built from scratch?" And Dad would nod and say, "She's got real hustle. She's a survivor." They didn't mean it as a dig. But it landed like one. That spring, Brielle threw a 3rd anniversary party for her brand. A pop-up in a converted warehouse complete with signature cocktails and a live band. She didn't invite me. I saw it on Instagram. She wore gold heels and a sequin jumpsuit and toasted her team for believing in the dream. Her caption read, "Couldn't have done this without the ones who stood by me. You know who you are." I stared at the screen for a full minute. Then I closed the app and opened my spreadsheet. The last transfer was on March 28th. Supplier emergency. That one she had called for. Voice trembling, panic clear. She said if the fabric didn't arrive on time, the whole spring launch would collapse. I wired it the same day. But I didn't log it in the spreadsheet. Not that one. That was the first time I stopped counting. And that I realized was the first time I stopped pretending this was about helping. The email came on a Wednesday morning. I was sitting at my tiny desk in my shared co-working space in Capitol Hill, sipping burnt coffee from the corner cafe and sorting through a stack of spreadsheets when I saw it. The subject line read, "Proposal, Modern IVX Brielle Holdings." At first, I thought it was another supplier invoice Brielle had accidentally forwarded. I almost archived it without reading. But the sender's name stopped me. Greg Summers. I'd met him once briefly at a fashion sustainability panel in New York back in 2020. He was sharp, well-spoken, the kind of man who always looked like he knew more than he was saying. Back then, Modern Ivy was a rising name in ethical basics. Now, 4 years later, they were everywhere. Urban Outfitters, Nordstrom, even a collab with Patagonia. His email was short, direct, and somehow more personal than I expected. Hi Madison, I understand you hold a majority stake in Belle. I'd like to discuss a potential partnership or acquisition. We're interested in acquiring a 60% share in the brand for $300,000. Alternatively, if you wish to retain your position, we'd be open to bringing you on as a strategic advisor for our capsule division. I reached out to Belle last year with a similar proposal. She declined outright. I didn't realize she wasn't the sole decision maker. Looking forward to your thoughts. Greg. I reread it 3 times. Then I closed my laptop and sat still for a long minute. No one had ever addressed me like that before. As if I mattered. As if I had the authority to choose. I'd been the invisible co-founder, the silent bank account, the name hidden deep in the registration papers that no one bothered to read. Yet here was the CEO of one of the most talked about brands in the industry treating me like an equal. I didn't respond. Not that day, not the day after. Instead, I opened a blank document and titled it What I Want. It felt silly at first, like an exercise a therapist might assign. But I typed anyway. I want to be seen. I want credit. I want financial security. I want a career that isn't tied to my sister's moods. I want to stop living in the shadows. By the time I hit save, it was nearly midnight. The next morning, Belle called. She needed another supplier payment. French tool this time, and the vendor refused to ship without a 50% deposit. I told her I'd think about it. She laughed. Maddie, I need this by Friday. I already told them it was coming. I didn't answer. She went quiet. Then, in a clipped voice, said, "Are you okay?" It was the first time she'd asked me that in almost 8 years. I could have said a lot, could have told her about the email. About the sleepless night. About how tired I was of playing accountant and therapist and emergency fund without so much as a name tag. But all I said was I'm working on a few things. I'll let you know. That weekend I dug through my storage unit and found the original operating agreement from when we'd incorporated Belle in 2015. I'd forgotten how simple it was. 20 pages, mostly boilerplate. But there it was in black and white. My name. My share. 61%. Full voting rights. My hands were shaking. I wasn't just a backer, I was the majority. I drove home in silence, the pages buckled from heat against the passenger seat. That night I printed the email from Greg and tucked it beside the agreement. Then I called an old friend from business school, Kara Franklin, who now worked in acquisitions for a private equity firm in Chicago. She picked up after 2 rings. Maddie, wow. It's been years. I didn't waste time. Kara, I need to understand what this means. I have someone offering to buy a controlling share in a company I co-own. I need to know if I'm being lowballed. She didn't hesitate. Send me everything. I'll look it over this weekend. On Sunday, she called back. The offer's legit, Maddie. Summers knows what he's doing. But $300,000 for 60%, that's a steal, especially if the brand has any following. The advisory role could be valuable long-term though. What do you want out of this? I hesitated. Honestly, I don't know. I've never actually asked myself that before. She was quiet for a moment, then said, "Then maybe start there." That night I took a walk through Volunteer Park. The sky was lavender and kids were playing by the fountain, and for the first time in a long time I wasn't just surviving the week. I was making a decision. On Monday morning I opened Greg's email and typed a reply. Hi Greg, thank you for reaching out. I appreciate your interest and the transparency about your previous discussions with Belle. I'm open to a conversation. Would you be available for a call later this week? Madison, I didn't send it right away. I stared at the screen for a full minute. My finger hovered over the trackpad. Then I clicked send. It wasn't revenge. Not yet, but it was the first step toward something else entirely. And maybe finally that something could be mine. The invitation came with the smell of smoke. Not real smoke, not yet. Just the kind that lingers in your memory when you think of backyard summers, overcooked hot dogs, and plastic lawn chairs sinking into dry grass. My mother called that Tuesday morning. "Hey sweetheart, we're having a little barbecue next weekend. Just the family. You should come. Everyone misses you." I almost laughed. Everyone. That word did a lot of heavy lifting. I hadn't been part of everyone in years. But I didn't say that. I just told her I'd think about it. Then I stared at my phone for a long time after the call ended. It wasn't curiosity or nostalgia that made me go. I didn't want their burgers or their forced hugs or the same old questions about whether I was still single. I went because the longer I waited, the longer Belle believed the silence meant surrender. Saturday came with heat, the kind of muggy Pacific Northwest summer day that felt borrowed from the South. I pulled into my parents' driveway just after 3. There were already cars lined up along the curb. Laughter floated from the backyard. Someone was playing a yacht rock playlist through tinny speakers. I could hear the clatter of soda cans being tossed into a cooler. I parked, turned off the engine, and sat for a moment. Then I got out, smoothed the front of my dress, and walked around the side gate like I hadn't spent the past 2 years actively avoiding these events. My mother saw me first. Her smile looked like it had been rehearsed. "There you are," she said, wrapping me in a hug before I could react. "We didn't think you'd make it." I didn't answer. She didn't wait. Inside the yard, folding tables were covered in blue gingham. My father was flipping burgers like he was auditioning for a commercial. My Uncle Mike was already a few beers deep holding court near the cooler, and then there was Belle. She wore a floaty linen dress in sage green and white sunglasses that made her look like she belonged on the cover of a summer issue. When she saw me, her mouth curved into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Look who finally decided to show up." I gave her a polite nod. She turned away like that was victory enough. Dinner was paper plates and plastic cutlery and too much ketchup. I sat on the edge of a lawn chair near the fence sipping lemonade, mostly ignored. Which was fine. Let them forget I was there, let them underestimate me a little longer. As the sun started to dip, someone brought out a bottle of rosé and Belle clinked her glass with a spoon. Speech time. She smiled sweetly, then turned to the crowd. "I just want to say how grateful I am to be with my family. It's been a huge year for me. Belle is finally turning a profit. We're expanding into wholesale and I've just signed on with a PR agency in LA. It's all happening." Applause. I didn't clap. And of course she went on raising her glass in my direction, a special thank you to Madison for showing up, I guess. It's nice you could make time even though fashion's never really been your thing. A few people chuckled. It wasn't even clever. Just a jab in silk. I didn't flinch. Instead, I stood up. "Actually," I said, letting my voice carry just enough. "I think this is a good time to clarify a few things." Belle froze, still holding her glass. I stepped forward slowly, setting my lemonade on the table. I caught my father's eyes. He looked confused. My mother looked nervous. Belle looked amused. "Go ahead," she said, still smiling. I kept my voice calm. "I'm not just the person who signs the checks. I own 61% of Belle Holdings. That means I have majority voting rights. That means every deal, every partnership, every branding decision technically requires my approval, including that PR agency in LA." The backyard went quiet, even the music cut out. Someone near the grill muttered, "Wait, what?" Brielle's face drained of color. "She's joking," she said, laughing too loud. "Madison helps with the books, sure," but I pulled a folded document from my bag and laid it gently on the table. Original operating agreement signed and notarized. My equity stake is on page 3. I suggest you read it before your next press release. She didn't move. Someone behind me whispered, "She owns 60%. 61, I corrected without looking back. I didn't stay for the hot dogs. I didn't wait for the whispers to turn into arguments or for my mother to come up with some excuse about how I'd misunderstood. I didn't need to. I turned, walked out through the side gate, and let the screen door slap shut behind me. For the first time in years, I felt weightless. Not triumphant, not vengeful, just done pretending. The first domino had fallen. and I was already walking away. By the time the smoke cleared from that backyard barbecue, I already knew what was coming. I didn't check my phone for a while, but when I finally did, the notifications stacked like bricks. First came Brielle's texts. "Madison, can you call me Madison? It's urgent." The supplier pulled the collection. "The website's been glitchy all morning. I'm getting cancellations." There were over 20 messages in the first 12 hours. Then came one from Dad. "You should talk to your sister. This is serious." And then another. "What exactly did you say at the barbecue?" By the next evening, they were standing outside my apartment in Portland. I heard the knock before I saw the caller ID. My building had one of those vintage buzzers that made the whole place vibrate. I debated pretending I wasn't home, but my reflection in the hallway mirror didn't flinch. So I opened the door. Brielle stood there with sunglasses still on, though the sun had long since set. Dad beside her looked more tired than angry. I didn't invite them in at first. I just stood there, one hand on the doorframe. "We just need 10 minutes," Brielle said quickly. "It won't take long," Richard added, using that voice he always did when he was trying to sound like a father again. I let them in. Not out of kindness, but because I wanted them to see something. We sat in my modest living room, the one they'd never visited before. No one asked why the furniture didn't match or why the coffee table was scratched. I grabbed the folder I'd had prepared for weeks. It was already sitting on the corner of the bookshelf. Brielle jumped right in. "We're having an issue with the warehouse. They froze shipments after Greg Summers reached out. He's claiming a majority shareholder approved a buyout, and they're asking for confirmation." I told them it had to be a mistake. I looked her straight in the eye. It wasn't. Her mouth dropped slightly. "Wait, you. Greg offered $300,000 for 60%. I said yes. Dad shot up from the couch. "You're selling your stake to a competitor." I didn't move. I opened the folder, took out the contract, and placed it gently on the table between us. "Section 7B," I said, tapping the clause. "Shareholder A may transfer or sell their equity to any third party at their discretion with no requirement for consent from shareholder B." Dad stared at the page like it was written in another language. "That's not what we agreed to when we set this up," he said. "What you agreed to," I corrected him. "I was never part of the real conversations. You just assumed I'd fund it and fade away." Brielle's voice cracked. "Maddie, you're going to kill everything I built." "No," I said, standing. "I'm just stepping out of the ICU. You've been on life support for years, but you kept pulling out the tube." "You didn't have to do this," she said, quieter now. "We could have figured something out. Together." "You mean like all the other times? Like when you needed money and called me crying, or when I asked for help and you said you were too busy?" Her silence was louder than any shout. I walked over to the window and looked out onto the street below. A delivery truck honked. Someone on a bike sped past. It was an ordinary night. Brielle stood and crossed the room. "You blindsided me. I didn't even know you were considering this." "That's the thing," I said, still looking out. "You never asked what I wanted. You just assumed I had nothing better to do than save you." Dad cleared his throat. "There's still time to walk this back. We could offer Greg a joint deal. Keep the brand in the family." "It's not in the family," I said, turning to face them. "It never was. You gave her the spotlight. I just paid for the bulbs." Brielle sat down heavily, her hands clenched in her lap. "So that's it, you're just done?" I nodded slowly. "For now, yes." She looked at me, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then what do I do?" I paused. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel the need to rescue her. "Maybe," I said softly, "you learn how to build something on your own. Without someone else footing the bill." Dad looked at me like he didn't recognize me. Maybe he didn't. Maybe they'd never really known who I was under the constant giving. Brielle stood again slowly. "You changed." "No," I said. "I just stopped disappearing." I opened the door. They left in silence. The night felt unusually quiet after they were gone. I stood for a long time staring at the closed door. And in the stillness, I realized something. They weren't knocking because they loved me. They were knocking because for the first time I had something they needed. And I wasn't going to hand it over. The morning air in Asheville had a faint crispness to it even though it was July. I stood by the kitchen window with my coffee cooling in my hand, staring blankly at the tree-lined street below. I hadn't slept much. Not because I was anxious, but because something was shifting. Inside me. Around me. Like the ground was finally settling after years of quiet earthquakes. My phone buzzed on the counter. Greg Summers. I picked it up on the third ring. I expected a follow-up email, maybe a revised offer. I didn't expect him to say in that smooth, direct voice of his, "I can be in Asheville by Thursday. We'll keep it off radar. Just you and me. I'll bring my legal team if you're ready to move." I held the phone between my cheek and shoulder as I stirred the untouched coffee. Why the urgency, Greg? Because if you don't, someone else will. The press is circling Brielle's brand like sharks. And I'm not in the habit of waiting when a legacy company is this vulnerable. I didn't say yes, but I didn't say no. He was right about one thing. The clock was ticking. The market didn't care about sentiment or sisterhood or stories that started in childhood bedrooms. The market responded to power. And for the first time I had it. That afternoon I found myself sitting on the edge of the couch, the 2015 shareholder agreement splayed out beside me, highlighted and annotated. A part of me wanted to believe Brielle would fight for it, or at least try to make things right. But all she had done since the BBQ was spiral and hide. That night I got a text from my mother. It was longer than usual. Paragraphs. "Madison, your sister isn't eating. She's barely leaving the apartment. She's behind on vendor payments. Her PR firm dropped her yesterday. I know you're angry and I know you've carried more than your share. But if you sell your shares to someone like Greg, she'll lose everything. Please, don't let this be how your relationship ends." I stared at her words for a long time. She wasn't wrong. But she wasn't exactly right either. This wasn't about ending a relationship. This was about how I had been the only one holding it together while the others had their hands free to live recklessly. I opened my camera roll and scrolled until I found the photo. A scan of the contract Brielle had made me sign in 2015. The one that gave her full managerial rights but kept me liable for every financial obligation. It was the same document she pretended didn't exist every time someone praised her for building Brielle from scratch. I attached the image and sent it to my mom with a single message. "You were there when she made me sign this. You said nothing. I learned silence from you, but I'm done being silent." My phone stayed dark after that. The next morning, I met with my attorney Audrey Chen at a quiet office suite above a bakery downtown. We had worked together during my time consulting for smaller brands, and she was one of the few people who didn't flinch when I talked about shareholder rights like they were personal. She slid the folder across the table. "You're protected. The clause is airtight. You can sell or license or restructure your stake any way you want. No board approval needed." I tapped the folder, considering it. "And what if I want to stay in but not stay silent?" She raised an eyebrow. "Then we draft a strategic shift agreement. You remain majority shareholder, remove her managerial control, and appoint a co-CEO or a new board. But it will get messy. Public." I thought of my mother's text. Of Brielle curled up in her penthouse, refusing to face what she built. I thought of how for 10 years I had let the world believe she was the genius, while I sat quietly balancing the books in a corner. Maybe it was time for the mess. That evening, as I was slicing tomatoes for a late dinner, my phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't a message. It was a FaceTime call. From Brielle. I let it ring until it stopped. Then another came in. From my mother. I declined both. Then a new message popped up. "Janet, I'm outside." I set down the knife, wiped my hands, and walked to the door. Sure enough, there she was, standing in a cardigan despite the heat, holding her purse like a shield. She looked older than I remembered. Not in years, but in wear. "Can I come in?" I stepped aside without a word. She walked slowly through my living room like she was in a museum. Her eyes landed on a framed photo on my bookshelf. The one from our childhood trip to Savannah before things got complicated. She sat on the edge of the couch. "Your sister is losing herself." I leaned against the kitchen counter. "Number." She's just being seen without the mask. She flinched, then softened. She's scared, Madison. We all are, Mom. She looked up at me then, eyes glassy. Why now? Why push this far? I walked over, picked up the contract, and placed it on the table between us. Because I've already given her more than I could afford. Time, labor, identity. And it's never been enough. Not for her. Not for you. She read the first page and her lips pressed into a thin line. She never told me it was like this. You didn't ask. Silence. Then quietly. What will you do? I haven't decided. But I'm done waiting for someone else to do right by me. She nodded slowly. When she left, she didn't hug me, didn't cry. She just touched the edge of the contract with her fingers, then walked out into the dusk. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel guilty for letting the door close behind her. Avery showed up at exactly 8:30 just as planned. Her heels clicked against the marble floor of the law office like a metronome, calm and controlled. She handed me a leather folder as we stepped into the elevator. You ready for this? She asked without looking at me. I nodded once. No turning back now. The family had requested a meeting through their attorney, saying it was a chance to talk everything through face to face. Of course, by family they meant Belle and our parents, plus their lawyer from the firm they had used for decades, the same man who had drafted every estate, asset, and trust document since we were kids. The receptionist led us to the conference room at the end of the hall where everything looked sterile and polite. Water glasses perfectly spaced. Legal pads untouched. A tray of stale croissants no one would eat. My mother sat at the far end next to my father, their postures stiff. Belle was already seated, face pale, and drawn, her blazer slightly oversized like it belonged to someone else. Her lawyer, a young man with an expensive tie and tired eyes, offered us a nod as we entered. I sat opposite them. Avery took the seat beside me and opened her folder with a practiced flick. Thank you for agreeing to meet today, Mr. Donovan began, folding his hands. We're here to discuss the issue of company ownership and hopefully reach an amicable understanding between parties. I waited. Let them speak first. I had learned over the years that silence made people uncomfortable. It forced them to fill it. Belle cleared her throat. I know things have been tense. I didn't want it to go this far. I thought we could settle this between us without turning it into a war. You signed a managerial rights contract without board review, Avery said flatly. That wasn't a misunderstanding. It was strategic. Belle winced. My father leaned forward, attempting diplomacy. Look, we all know this company was your shared dream. Maybe we handled things poorly, but erasing the original agreement now doesn't help anyone. We're asking that you transfer the shares back under Belle's control and we'll compensate you fairly. Clean break. Fresh start. Avery opened the second section of the folder. This is a complete record of all financial and legal documentation surrounding Madison's role in Belle. You'll find over 80 email chains where she initiated business strategy, 32 signed invoices she processed, and 12 wire transfers from her personal account to cover launch expenses, including a loan of $50,000 that remains unpaid. Donovan frowned. That's not the point here. The shares, Avery said, were never hers alone to begin with. You're asking my client to erase her ownership stake in a company she co-built and funded based on nothing but sentiment. My mother shifted, visibly uncomfortable. It was never supposed to be permanent, she said quietly. You were helping your sister get started. We thought you'd move on. That's the problem, I said, finally breaking my silence. You all assumed I was temporary, disposable. But the company didn't grow because Belle smiled in magazine shoots. It grew because I stayed up nights with spreadsheets and supplier calls and logistics. Belle's voice cracked. I never meant to cut you out. I just thought you didn't want the spotlight. You always seemed like you hated it. I did. But hating the spotlight doesn't mean I wanted to disappear. I supported you. I trusted you. And you handed our legacy to PR firms while pretending I never existed. Avery pulled out a final sheet, sliding it across to Donovan. This is our formal declaration. Madison retains majority ownership and effective immediately managerial rights are suspended pending review. If your client wishes to negotiate terms of co-CEO appointment or equity buyout, we're open to proposals. But we won't be bullied into forfeiting legal ground. No one spoke for a while. The only sound was the hum of the AC and the soft click of Brielle's manicured nails tapping the glass of water she hadn't touched. I'm not trying to destroy anyone, I said after a long pause. But I'm not going to keep losing pieces of myself just so someone else can have everything. Donovan pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose. That's clear. Avery stood and began collecting our documents. I did the same. Before we left, Brielle looked up at me, her voice small. Is this really it? I hesitated, then nodded. It doesn't have to be the end. But it's the end of me staying quiet. We walked out without shaking hands. No one followed. As the elevator doors closed, Avery exhaled and turned to me. You did better than most CEOs I've worked with. And I've worked with plenty. I gave a small smile but said nothing. My hands were steady. My heart was not racing. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel cruel. I just felt clear. Outside, the sky had darkened. A summer storm gathering over the mountains. We stepped into it anyway. The official court date came faster than I expected. Maybe because I no longer counted days in dread. Maybe because I had finally stopped rehearsing every version of what I might say if asked to explain myself. I didn't need to explain anymore. Brielle's legal team tried to make noise. She filed a lawsuit claiming I had coerced her into signing the 2015 contract. Said I'd exploited her youth, her trust, that I'd taken advantage of a moment of weakness to gain control of the company. It was the same kind of theater I'd grown up watching her perform in our family. First the victim, then the martyr, then the phoenix. She always had a role ready. She just never expected I'd have a stage of my own one day. Avery wasn't fazed. She walked into the hearing like it was a formality. In her calm, deliberate tone, she laid out the chain of evidence, the email exchanges, the recorded Zoom meeting where Brielle thanked me for stepping up, the financial documents showing how she had signed off on every deal with full knowledge. We even had a voice memo where Brielle had laughed, saying she was relieved someone else was willing to handle the hard parts while she focused on branding. The judge didn't need long. 2 weeks later, the decision was issued. The suit was dismissed in full. There would be no trial. I found out while folding laundry. I didn't jump. Didn't cry. I just stared at the phone for a moment and exhaled. The relief wasn't sharp. It was slow. Like the sound of a door unlocking in the distance, one you didn't realize you were trapped behind. Later that evening, I sat on the porch with a cup of mint tea. The air had cooled just enough to carry the scent of pine from the trees across the hill. I watched the clouds shift in long streaks across the sky and let myself imagine a season that didn't begin with fear. That's when Greg called. He didn't start with pleasantries, didn't ask how I was doing. He just said, "We want to bring you in." Officially. Not to run things, just to help rebuild. Consult, advise, shape the new direction. We're keeping your name on the legacy line. That wasn't even up for debate. I was quiet. He added, "Look, I know this can't undo everything. But if you're interested, there's a seat at the table, and this time no one's going to try to take it from you." I didn't say yes. Not then. But I didn't say no either. Avery and I went over the offer together. I wouldn't be taking back shares. No ownership, no liability. Just creative input, brand guidance, and a permanent credit on the collection that carried my name. And more importantly, a quiet acknowledgement that I hadn't imagined it all. That the work I did mattered. That weekend, I took a trip up to a small cabin in the North Cascades. No signal, no inbox. Just time. Time to think about what I wanted to do with the years ahead of me now that they were truly mine. One morning, I scribbled something in my journal I hadn't dared write before. I am allowed to move on without dragging the whole weight of them behind me. The next day, I emailed Greg. Let's do it. Back in Seattle, we signed the new agreement. Avery was there, and so was Greg's daughter, now a junior creative director. She shook my hand and said quietly, "I grew up watching you build this. I still have a sketch you shared in an old team memo." It made me believe women like us could start something without needing to be loud about it. It took me a second to respond. I just smiled and said, then I guess it worked. When the rebrand launched, there was no press release about me. No grand statement. Just a small notation inside the company archives and a signature line that read concept created and nurtured by Madison Hartley. That was enough. A few weeks later, I got a card in the mail. It had no return address, just a hand-inked envelope with my name in careful lettering. Inside was a single line. She tried to wear your crown, but it never fit her head. No name, no explanation. But I knew. I tucked it into a drawer I rarely opened. Not out of fear, just out of a choice to leave some things where they belonged. Behind me. That night I sat by the window, a blanket over my shoulders, and thought about all the years I had spent trying to prove my worth to people who couldn't see past their own reflections. Maybe I had lost time. Maybe I had lost money. Maybe I had even lost parts of myself I wouldn't get back, but I hadn't lost my voice, and I wasn't going to waste it telling people what they missed. I was going to use it building the life I never stopped dreaming of, even when they called me foolish for it. Even when they told me I was just the backup plan. The shadow. The placeholder. Not anymore. I didn't need a final word in court. I didn't need to win some headline battle. I just needed to know in the quiet of my own skin that I stayed. That I didn't break. That I chose peace. And it chose me back. 3 months later, I found myself standing behind a podium in a glass-walled conference room, overlooking downtown Charlotte. It was the annual Women in Resilience Summit, and I had been invited not as a cautionary tale but as a speaker. A voice worth listening to. I looked out over the sea of faces, young professionals, seasoned founders, mothers who had built businesses between school pickups. All of them waiting. Not for a scandal. Not for gossip. Just to hear how someone survives being erased and chooses not to vanish. I didn't name names. I didn't need to. I talked about what it meant to start something when no one believed in you, and what it takes to keep going when the people you love are the ones who hope you'll quit. I spoke about betrayal dressed in designer smiles, and how sometimes the biggest wins don't come with applause but with silence, peaceful earned silence. When I finished, the room stayed quiet for a breath longer than I expected. Then came the sound that nearly buckled my knees. A standing ovation. I walked off the stage slowly, letting it sink in. I hadn't been clapped for because I'd won a court case or taken down a rival. They clapped because I was still here. Because I had lived through it and rebuilt. Because I had found a way to stay soft without being stepped on. A few days later, the official papers arrived. Greg had finalized the buyout of Brielle's remaining shares. 40% clean. No more theatrics. No more lawsuits. He renamed the company Ivy and West, a nod to his wife's favorite street corner cafe in Denver and the west-facing studio where I first sketched our flagship design. I kept my 60% and stepped back from the day-to-day. I didn't need to lead every meeting or sign off on every decision. I stayed on as a strategic advisor, someone the team consulted when direction felt uncertain or branding needed clarity. But I no longer lived in the noise. Instead, I moved to Asheville. Found a quiet house near the Blue Ridge Parkway. A place where the fog clings to the treetops in the morning and the air smells like rain even before it falls. I planted a garden. I learned to cook things I used to microwave. I started drawing again, not for campaigns or collections, but just for me. It wasn't about hiding, it was about choosing stillness over survival. Then one afternoon in late November, I received a group email from my mother. Subject line: family holiday gathering. She had BCC'd everyone, probably to avoid the drama of replies. The message was formal. Time, date, location. The usual casserole assignments. She mentioned that it would be a smaller group this year. That space was limited. That it would just be immediate family. I wasn't listed. There was no follow-up. No quiet text. No attempt at softening the omission. I stared at the screen, waiting for the old heat to rise. The shame. The disbelief. The ache of being the one left out of a photo again. But it never came. I closed the laptop, stood up, and walked outside. The wind was cool. My garden was fading into winter, but even the bare stems looked proud. I wasn't hurt, I wasn't angry. I was free. For the first time in my life, I wasn't measuring my worth by a chair at someone else's table. I had built my own, and it didn't need to fit inside their dining room. That night, I made pumpkin soup and called Avery. We talked about new projects. She mentioned a nonprofit that wanted design mentorship for teen girls from underserved schools. I said yes before she finished the sentence. I wanted to give my time to people who hadn't already decided what I could or couldn't be. The following week, I received a letter from a college student in San Diego. She had watched a clip of my summit speech online and wrote to tell me she cried halfway through because, in her words, it felt like someone had finally said out loud what she'd been holding in for years. She said her older sister always took the spotlight, that her parents saw her as backup, that she had almost given up on herself until she heard my story. She ended the letter with this: "Thank you for choosing yourself. You helped me believe I could too." I kept the letter on my nightstand. Not for ego, for grounding. For the reminder that when you survive something cruel and choose not to become it, that's the real victory. On Christmas Eve, I lit a candle for the version of me who once begged to be seen. I didn't cry. I just whispered thank you to the quiet. I didn't go to the family gathering. I didn't need to. Because I wasn't missing from that room. I had simply outgrown it. So many of us spend years waiting for someone else to pick us to finally say we're enough to offer a seat we've earned 100 times over. But sometimes the most radical thing you can do is stop waiting. Sometimes healing isn't about confrontation, it's about creation. About building a life so rooted in truth that exclusion no longer feels like punishment, it feels like peace. And if you're listening to this wondering if it's too late to start again or too selfish to walk away, let me say it clearly, it's not. If you've ever been the one who gave and gave only to be dismissed, if you've been the shadow behind someone else's spotlight, the name they forgot to include, tell me your story. Because you deserve to be heard. And maybe, just maybe, it's time you chose yourself first.